Okay, welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to see you all here on the 1st of May. I'm James Putzel. I'm Professor of Development Studies at the International Development Department here at the school. And it gives me a lot of pleasure to welcome Ha-Joon Chang back to the LSE. Anybody who's studying development anyway at the LSE is really familiar with Ha-Joon's work. In fact, you can't really graduate in development studies here without having read Ha-Joon.
Thanks to you, yeah.
Ha-Joon is an economist in the best tradition of Cambridge economics, though the University of Cambridge doesn't always recognize that tradition. I mean, he's there after predecessors like Pigou, Keynes, Sraffa, Joan Robinson, Richard Kahn, Hans Singer, very important to our study of development. Ha-Joon, throughout his career, and especially in the last 2 decades, has kind of boldly stood up to dominant orthodoxies in modern economics. And he's pursued the study of economic change with a really keen eye to history, politics, sociology, and philosophy, which is really at the heart of what classical political economy was really about. He's been a courageous defender in the economics discipline of pluralism in both theory and methodology. I think this is one of the most important contributions and the contribution of this book that we're launching tonight. Ha-Joon is author of a really impressive list of books, articles, book chapters, policy papers, and I'm not going to try to mention them all tonight, but I do want to flag some of the earlier ones which have a lasting importance. His book, The Political Economy of Industrial Policy, extremely important for thinking about development. The East Asian Development Experience, and Globalization, Economic Development, and the Role of the State. But in recent years, Ha-Joon has turned to a wider audience. The first one I remember having quite a big impact among our students was Reclaiming Development, which you wrote with Irene, I don't know if it was the first one, but with Irene Grabel. Then came Bad Samaritans, The Guilty Secrets of Rich Nations. You have a way of finding great titles, I think. And then, of course, as everybody knows, the bestseller. I mean, most of us in academia never get on a bestsellers list. That's 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. I like to claim a tiny bit of credit in pushing Ha-Joon on the trajectory he's currently following, because back in the late 1990s, I was locked into debates with senior officials of the then newly established Department for International Development. Do we have any of you here tonight? Different people? Anyway, I was debating with them about the problems of imposing the so-called good governance agenda on developing country governments in exchange for getting aid. This has to do with introducing, the institutions and rules of financial probity, of competitive democratic politics, etc., on poor countries. And so I suggested to them that they commission some research that would look at the good governance agenda in the UK history. And I suggested they turn to Ha-Joon. So Ha-Joon did that piece of work, and somewhat later, it was published in what has become an extremely important volume, I think, for anybody working on development. And he published it under a title who's borrowing the words from one of the most important interpreters of late development, Friedrich List, the German political economist. And that book was Kicking Away the Ladder, Development Strategy in Historical Perspective. That same year, and that was 2002, Ha-Joon came out with an article in the Cambridge Journal of Economics titled Breaking the Mold, where he laid out his own vision and his own version of an institutionalist political economy. So in my mind, that remains one of the most trenchant dissections and critical assessments of neoliberalism, the ideology of neoliberalism, or the set of doctrines that are associated with neoliberalism. And I think that book, that article, which demolished the effort of those propagating that doctrine to appropriate neoclassical economics, and also dissected neoliberalism to look at what schools of economics were involved with it. That article, I think, though Ha-Joon may not agree with me, is the expert foundation to this wonderful book that is launched today, which is the Economics, the User's Guide. Now, tonight we're launching this book, and we need to note something very special, I think, about this book. This is the first in the relaunching of Penguin's Pelican series of books. And this series was first launched in 1937. The very first author was George Bernard Shaw, who published The Intelligent Women's Guide to Socialism and Capitalism. The idea of the Pelican series was to commission experts to explain in ways that are accessible to the public extremely important and complex issues of the day. And so it's in a great tradition that Ha-Joon is publishing in that series. And in fact, as I looked at it today, because I didn't have access to it before, I decided that we have a lot of students who come to do development studies who have no economics background. So I think we're going to make it required. My first thought was to make it required for all those students to read this book before they arrive. But as I thought about it more, I thought even more important are those students who have a first degree in economics should read this book before they arrive to do development studies. Yeah. The book is an attempt, in Ha-Joon's words, to lay out different approaches to understanding economics and let his readers make their own judgments. So he says right in the beginning, he's not telling the reader how to, he's telling the reader or showing the reader how to think, but not what to think. There's a wonderful kind of trawl through economics outlining 9 different schools or traditions. And he presents them also in mixed forms, as mixed cocktails. And one of the injunctions he makes is how deadly it is to consume only one of them. Yeah? So I think we couldn't have a more appropriate way here at the LSE to actually celebrate International Workers' Day. It's May 1. Many of you probably don't even know that May 1 is International Workers' Day. But it's in the tradition of making complex ideas accessible to the wider public so that they can use them and use their own judgment to develop and their own participation in our society, in our politics, that this series has been launched, and we couldn't have a better contributor than Dr. Ha-Joon Chang. So I welcome you.
Well, thank you, James, for that very kind introduction. Yes, I mean, as I acknowledge in the acknowledgement section of my kicking of the ladder, without James kind of arranging me to write that paper on governance reform, which forms the second part of kicking of the ladder, that book would not have come out and my life would have been very different. So thank you, James. Well, do I have my PowerPoint? Yes. Yeah. So I'm, as James introduced, going to talk about this book, which is the very first volume in the Revive series of Pelican paperbacks. You know, the Pelican was quite an institution. You know, it covered everything from the universe to ants, from economics to bird watching. Yeah, I'm not lying. You know, that you can go and check. From philosophy to design, and I especially have a special thing about Pelican because you know I grew up in South Korea in the early went to university in South Korea in the early 1980s. When Korea was still a very poor country, and Pelican paperbacks were the only imported books that you could possibly buy because other books are just so expensive. Yeah? I mean, of course, we pirate copied even Pelicans. No, because you know, I mean, I was lucky enough to come from a well-off family and could buy a few copies of Pelican, but all the others didn't have money, you know. So how do you read these things, you know? Pirate copied. You know? Yeah, so even today I tell my readers, look, if your country's per capita income is below $10,000, please go ahead and pirate copy my book. Anyway, so Pelican was one of the few books that we could actually realistically buy, and I did own a few copies, including one Galbraith volume. So I'm really honored to be the first author in this new series. Now, in this book, as I say, I'm going to offer a kind of accessible introduction to economics, at least easier than George Bernard Shaw. It's quite a dense book, you know. I tried to read it, I couldn't finish. Yeah, so in this book, I did my best to write it in a very accessible way, and try to offer something completely different, yeah? As Monty Python used to say. Well, in this book, I try my best to dispel this widespread notion that economics is very difficult. Yeah? Yeah, actually, when you think about it, it's quite a strange thing because, you know, I'm sure all of you have very strong views on all sorts of things. Yeah? Gay marriage, Iraq, nuclear power stations, global warming, without actually having any qualification to make judgments on this. No, seriously, I mean, you know, I have my views on Iraq, but what do I know about international politics? You know, I don't have a degree in politics. Yeah? So we are quite willing to make a strong judgment on just about everything except for economics. Yeah? When it comes to economics, people say, oh, it's a technical issue, I don't know, maybe those clever guys in the Treasury and the Bank of England will all know what the answer is, but not me. But why? Yeah? And I say that this is only because the economists have been fantastically successful in convincing other people that the subject is so difficult that they wouldn't understand it, even if they try to explain it to them. Yeah? But actually, in my previous book, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, I stuck my neck out and said actually 95% of economics is common sense. Well, of course, made to look difficult with the use of mathematics and jargons. And even the remaining 5% can be understood in its essence, if not in all technical details, if somebody bothers to explain it in an accessible way, which is what I try to do in this book. Now, being accessible doesn't mean that I'm trying to give you some baby version of economics. Yeah? I mean, idiot's guide to economics, 10 points to remember. Yeah? No. This is not what I do. I take my readers very seriously, so I discuss all kinds of very difficult issues, the definition of economics, the role of ethical values and politics in economics, how there are many different ways of conceptualizing the economy, and why and how they matter. You know, for example, today we are so used to the neoclassical school, which conceptualizes the economy as a collection of individuals. Huh? But Adam Smith, David Ricardo, these people who neoclassical economists think are their intellectual grandfathers, the classical economists, they actually didn't theorize the economy as a collection of individuals. They theorized the economy as a collection of classes, yeah? Capitalists, landlords, workers. And they had a whole different theory of how the economy develops. Their focus was on production rather than market exchange, although they did extol the virtues of market. You know, what was the very first thing that Adam Smith wrote about? He didn't write about market. He wrote about a factory, yeah? A pin factory. Yeah? This is where he talks about the importance of what he calls the division of labor. He says if one person tries to make a pin, maybe he can make 1 pin a day, maybe 20 pins a day, because he has to do everything. Yeah? So draw the wire, cut the wire, sharpen the wire, and so on and so on. Yeah? And Adam Smith says, however, if you divide this into, say, 10 different steps and make 10 people specialize in each step, productivity increases enormously. He reports that typically this will allow each worker to produce 4,800 pins a day. So that 10 of them collectively that produces 48,000. So they are very much interested in production rather than market exchange. Anyway, so there are many different ways of conceptualizing the economy, and I try to tell my readers there are all these different ways. Yeah? So this is the table of contents, and as you can see from here, I talk about a lot of things that are not talked about in economics books these days. Yeah? So I have a huge chapter on economic history, big chapter on different schools of economics. I also talk about what is economics, which I'll talk about in a minute. I also deal with certain issues that are neglected in economics these days, production, work. I'll talk about them later too. I also introduce the reader to lots of what I call real-life numbers. You know, we all have this notion that economics is a numbers subject. Yeah? But honestly, grab a recent economic graduate, ask him or her some basic numbers. What is the national output of your economy? What is the size of the world economy? What proportion of it is produced by China? They'll have no idea, because they are never taught these things. Yeah? Of course, in this internet age, it's not important to remember these numbers, because you can always look them up like that. Yeah? But you actually have to know some of these numbers to have some feel about these numbers, even just to know what to look for, where. Yeah? So I keep a lot of, in the second part of the book, on the sort of more topic-oriented chapters, I actually, at the end of each the section, have a subsection called real-life numbers, giving all these numbers. Yeah? Now, despite emphasizing the importance of numbers, I am at pains to tell my readers that numbers need to be taken with a pinch of salt, sometimes with a bag of salt. Yeah? You know, the German writer and scientist Johann Wolfgang von Goethe said something very significant in this respect. He said everything factual is already a theory. Because numbers in economics are not like numbers in physics or chemistry. Yeah? I mean, these are artificially constructed numbers. Yeah? So unemployment, yeah? How do you define unemployment? Yeah? I mean, can you just count the number of people who are not working and divide it by the general population and say that's the rate of unemployment? No, because some people do not even want to work. Yeah? Full-time students. Yeah? No. I mean, I'm not saying it in a kind of negative way. You know, homemakers, yeah? or people who are retired, who don't want to work. So there are people who don't want to work, but then exactly how do you define people who don't want to work? Because the way usually you define in National Unemployment Survey, according to the methodology internationally agreed through the ILO, the International Labour Organization, you actually should have applied for a job in the last 4 weeks to be counted as someone who is willing to work. Now, in an economic environment like today's, there are a lot of what is known as discouraged workers. They have applied for 200 jobs, all failures. They got fed up. They have been exhausted, so they haven't applied for jobs for the last couple of months. Despite the fact that they really want to and need to work. But then when there's a unemployment survey, they'll be recorded as outside the labor force. But why is it 4 weeks? Why not 2 weeks? Why not 8 weeks? So these are all kind of some kind of judgment. So, I mean, I can go on with these kind of examples, but you have to accept that the economic numbers are actually constructed with a lot of theoretical assumptions behind them, and you need to understand those assumptions in order to truly understand what these figures mean. Okay, so now two more details. Well, first of all, let's talk about the definition of economics. What is economics? Now, if we ask people who have never studied economics, what is economics? They'll say, of course, it's the study of the economy. I mean, the chemistry is a study of chemicals. Sociology is a study of society, so economics must be the study of the economy. Unfortunately, they'll be wrong. Well, at least according to some of the most popular economic books over time, because according to these books, economics is about the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. As in the famous the comedy science fiction, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, written by late Douglas Adams. Now, this was made into a movie, actually. In 2005, the leading actor there was Martin Freeman, who, of course, is today known better for The Hobbit and Sherlock. The movie is not as good as the book, but it's still good because the book is so good. Anyway, so in that book, there's this thing called, I'm not going to tell you more about it, but there's this thing called the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. And indeed, looking at the most popular economics books of today, you could actually say that the economics is almost about life, the universe, and everything. You see, Tim Harford, Stephen Levitt, Robert Frank, I mean, these are some of the most popular authors of the sort of general economics books. And all of their books have something about life, everything, the universe. Well, not exactly the universe, but at least the world, Now, you may think I'm being unfair because, these are books that, oh, sorry, I skipped one bit, I'm sorry, Now, according to these books, so economics can basically explain everything. Now, when you think about it, this is some claim coming from a subject which has totally failed in the area which other people will think is main job, namely explaining the economy. No, I mean, this is a serious case of megalomania. You cannot even explain your own area, and then you claim that, yes, actually I can explain everything. How come, Well, of course, being unfair because, these are all mass market books, the mass market has book market has the tough competition. You have to draw attention. I know. I mean, I operate in that market. Title is 50% of the book. So, you have to come up with the eye-catching title. But, my point is that even if they are hyped up, these titles could have been hyped up in a different way. You could have had titles like "How My Book Explains Everything About the Economy." Yeah, you could have done that. But they say that how my book can explain everything about everything, not just the economy. This is a very important the point, because this is not by accident. This is fundamentally based on what happened in this building, maybe the next building, in this the institution 70 years ago, when Lionel Robbins, the former professor at LSE, wrote this famous book, the small book called An Essay on the Nature and Significance of Economic Science in 1932, where he defined economics as the science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means, which have alternative uses, namely what is known as rational choice theory. Excuse me. So in this definition, economics is defined not by its the object of investigation, namely the economy, but it's by its analytical methodology, namely rational choice theory. So actually, in this view, it doesn't really matter what you are studying. As far as you use this particular methodology, then you can be called economics. This is why free economics has hardly anything that people normally associate with economics. The book is full of things like sumo wrestlers and Chicago drug dealers and contestants in the quiz show Weakest Link and so on. But then this is supposed to be economics because it uses this particular methodology to analyze human behavior. And when you take that view, yes, I mean, you think nothing of claiming that you can actually explain everything. Because potentially your methodology can be applied to every aspect of human behavior. Now, this is once again, I mean, some claim, because even physicists, neoclassical economists role model, admit that they have failed to develop a theory of everything. No, actually, in physics there is this notion of theory of everything, but no one has come up with it. And this unique definition. This definition is really unique when you think about it, because all other subjects define its identity in terms of the object of its inquiry. So you go to a biology department, there are people doing all sorts of different things in order to understand living organisms. So some people will do, of course, DNA analysis. Some others might do anatomy. Some people will do nasty experiments with rats. Some of them might mathematically model animal behavior, and some of them might go and sit in the jungles of Rwanda watching gorillas, but they are all called biologists because they all study living organisms in one way or another. But in economics, with this definition, no, actually that kind of pluralist attitude is impossible, because unless you do it in a particular way, you are not an economist. My contention is that economics should be defined not by its methodology, but by its object of investigation, like all other subjects. That is the economy, or how we produce goods and services, how we distribute the incomes generated in the process, and how we exchange and consume those goods and services that have been produced. Now, one important consequence of this neoclassical definition of economics is to make neoclassical economists believe that there's only one right way of doing economics. Rational choice theory. But as James already mentioned, in the book I emphasize that there are at least 9 different major schools of economics, with each with its own unique strengths and weaknesses. You could cite quite a few more if you look at more minor schools, or split the major schools into different sub-schools. And interestingly, there are 3 schools of economics which you can describe as free market economics. Of course, neoclassical economics has 2 versions. One is the free market version, as it is practiced today. Another is actually not a free market version, welfare economics, market failure and all that. So the neoclassical economics is actually not the same as the free market economics, but there is a version of free market economics based on neoclassical economics, but that's not the only type of free market economics. There's the classical school, which theorizes the economy on the basis of classes rather than individuals. There's the Austrian school, which have, once again, a very different view of human rationality and uncertainty and so on. The Austrian view is that the world is so uncertain and no one knows anything, the government shouldn't interfere. The neoclassical view is that the government should, the free market version of the neoclassical view is that the government shouldn't interfere because everyone knows what is going on. So these are very different. Well, anyway, please read the book for the explanation. I cannot. But in introducing all these different theories, my view is that we actually need all of them, because they all have something to contribute. And in making that contention, I give you what I call the Singapore problem, or what I call life is stranger than fiction. If you read about Singapore in, say, the Economist magazine or the Wall Street Journal, we'll only hear about this the free trade policy and its welcoming attitude towards foreign investors, which it has, but you will never be told that basically 90% of land is owned by the government, 85% of housing is provided by government-owned housing corporation, and a staggering 22% of national output is produced by state-owned enterprises, including the famous Singapore Airlines, when international average in that respect is about 9%. So I often tell my students, give me one economic theory. Doesn't matter what it is, neoclassical, classical, Marxist, Keynesian, Schumpeterian, one economic theory that can explain Singapore, and there isn't one. In order to understand something like Singapore, you need all these different theories. So in the book, I argue that we have to let 100 flowers bloom. There isn't just one right way of doing economics, but many different ways, each with its own strengths and weaknesses, and we need to have all of them. I actually go one step further and argue that we have to have them cross-fertilized. Because even among the supposed the enemies in this economic debate, there are a lot of common grounds. For example, the Marxists and Austrians, they want to kill each other. But actually, when it comes to the view of competition and innovation and so on, they are actually much closer to each other than to the neoclassical school. Hayek in the 1940s wrote a series of articles criticizing the neoclassical view of competition. He says neoclassical view of perfect competition is a state of an economy in which there is nothing that we recognize as that competition happens. It's basically the state of paralysis. No one has any market power, no one can do anything, that's perfect competition. But Hayek says, like Schumpeter, like Marx, capitalism developed because someone innovates, someone that comes up with a completely new idea, creating monopoly, destroying this that state of perfect competition. Anyway, that's just one example. So, that there are a lot of the grounds to develop this cross-fertilization. And my advice in this regard is that you should you should try not to be a man or a woman with a hammer. This happens if you study only one type of economic theory and acquire one tool known as the hammer. And then you start to see everything as a nail. Yeah, and then you begin to bang everything. Yeah, if you're lucky and if it happens to be a nail, great. But, what if it's an egg, So I suggest that we should all get a Swiss Army knife, with a range of tools, and of course that you need to study history, politics, and institutions to get the sense to know what to choose in what context. But this is what you need. Unfortunately, today's economics education is too much focused on one theory, making people basically a man or a woman with a hammer. Okay. Gosh, how much time do I have?
Okay, 10
minutes,
15 minutes.
Okay. No, I'll have to. Yeah. Okay. So I said that I will talk about work and production, but I don't think I have time for both of them. So I'll talk about work only. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is that it is not just in terms of introducing different types of economic theory and arguing for their cross-fertilization that my book is different from other economics books. It also deals with a number of topics that are neglected in other economics books, and the two of them, the most important ones are production and work. Now, work is an interesting issue because, outside the weekends and holidays, most people of working age spend at least half of their waking hours in work, and a lot more if you include the commuting hours. Especially if you're some unlucky black guy stuck in one of the townships in South Africa, you could be spending up to 6 hours commuting. Because there is no public transport. You have to use this highly overpriced minibuses that are strangely called taxis in that country that are run by gangsters. And they have to travel in very kind of under paved and ridiculous roads. So sometimes it takes 3 hours to get into the city to go to your work. So the work actually counts for a huge part of our life, but how many economics books, except in labor economics, have you read that talks about work? Very few. There's a reason, because the dominant economic theory, neoclassical theory, mainly conceptualizes people as consumers and not workers. And in that theory, work is this utility that you have to put up with so that you can earn money, which you can use to buy goods and services whose consumption gives you the utility. So your aim of life is actually consumption. Work is only a means. However, what happens in our workplace fundamentally affects us, not just our immediate physical and psychological well-being, but also our identity, our sense of dignity, and our self-fulfillment. And it is because we have ignored these important dimensions that we have created this society where we are, in terms of monetary income, richer, but a lot less happy. Because work is more stressful. Especially if you're a warehouse worker working for Amazon. There's GPS machine that are monitoring you. There's a lot more pressure to perform in terms of performance-related pay. I'm not against performance-related pay per se, but very often these performances have to be measured in a very simplistic way, And when it comes to things like NHS and these complex areas, I mean, it's okay if you are making T-shirts, but in those areas, this performance-related pay can be quite destructive and very stressful for workers. You have now longer and more crowded commutes. You have less job security, which puts a lot of stress on you. Yeah, so you are a lot unhappier, but then economists tell you, well, you should feel happy because your incomes are 20% higher than 15 years ago. Yeah? But you are not. Yeah? Why? You need to think about these things. Yeah? And finally, throughout the book, I emphasize that economics is a political argument. Of course, most neoclassical economists claim that, what we do is value-free science. Yeah? Get politics out of economics. This is why they renamed the subject at the end of 19th and early 20th century, which used to be called political economy. Yeah? Politics was an integral part of economics. Now it's supposed to be something that shouldn't be there. The Pareto criterion that neoclassical economists use to judge whether something is a social improvement is one example of how an ostensibly apolitical position in economics is actually based on a fundamentally political position. The Pareto principle says that you can call something a social change or improvement only when it makes some people better off without making anyone worse off. It's quite a respectable position, because unless you have something like that, it's very difficult to defend individual against the tyranny of the majority. Yeah? So to explain this, I talk about what I call the one-finger problem, which I actually don't talk about in the book, but this is special for people who bother to come to listen to me. If someone turns up at my door tomorrow morning, says, "Oh, Dr. Chang, we found this wonderful technology that will solve the problem of global warming overnight. But we need one critical ingredient, and we want you to donate it." So I said, "What is it?" Yeah? "Oh, we need one live human finger for this machine to start working." Yeah, I'll gladly chop off one of my fingers to save the world. Yeah? But what if it's one arm? I think I'll do it. But what if it's my life, my family's life, the life of all 50 million Koreans, or 6 million Jews, or whatever? Yeah? Where do you stop? Yeah? So this Pareto principle was advanced by people who are really concerned with this issue. So it's a very respectable position. However, this creates an inherent bias towards the status quo, because it literally gives veto power to every single individual. So if there's one rich guy who has taken everything through corrupt means and says, "No, I don't want any change. You cannot take even 1 cent from me because I don't like it," and then you cannot make any social reform. So the Pareto, this notion of Pareto improvement is a respectable position, but it is still a political position. It's not apolitical, as a lot of economists will try to tell you. No. And even when they don't explicitly use the Pareto criterion, many neoclassical economists take an implicit political position, as they usually accept the given distribution of income and wealth as given. The best example is Paul Krugman, as progressive as it comes for a neoclassical economist. In the late 1990s, he was involved in this debate with some American NGOs who were campaigning against low wages in subsidiaries of American multinational companies in poor countries. And Krugman waded in and said, no, you people are quite misguided. Yeah? You are talking as if these poor workers in Bangladesh have a choice between a low-wage job and a high-wage job. No, actually, their choice is between a low-wage job and no job. Yeah? So actually, they are better off with low-wage jobs. What are you talking about? Yeah? Well, he's absolutely correct if you take everything as given. But what if Bangladesh has a land reform, which will keep more workers in the countryside and put less pressure on urban wages? What if it can pass some strict labor regulation that can protect workers' rights and raise wages, including minimum wage law and so on? What if Bangladesh can have a better industrial policy to create more high-wage jobs? Well, you might say, those are all unrealistic, but those are exactly what countries like South Korea and Taiwan did in the period of economic miracle. That's how they created the higher wage economy. Now, of course, I mean, you can debate whether this or that particular policy in Bangladesh is realistic or not, but it's a matter of debate. It's not a given. But even someone like Paul Krugman starts from the assumption that, yes, there'll be no fundamental social change in Bangladesh, and given all this, yes, these jobs offered by Gap and so on in Bangladesh are totally acceptable. That's still a political position. But it goes even deeper because, as I say in the first chapter of this book, even defining what is in the market is a political exercise. And to make this point, in the chapter I talk about the example of child labor. When the social reformers that wanted to regulate child labor in early 19th century in Britain, a lot of free market economists are up in arms. They said this is undermining the very foundation of a free market economy, namely the freedom of contract. These children want to work, these people want to employ them. What is your problem? It's not like these people kidnap these children and use them as slave labor. They actually want to work. Now, of course, today, not even the most ardent advocates of free market say we need to bring back child labor. Well, actually, there's one person who said that, Newt Gingrich. No, he said that poor children should work as janitors in school. But that's the closest you got. So today, even the most strong advocate of free market don't say that we need to bring back child labor to truly liberalize our economy, because they have come to accept that the rights of children to have a childhood and education should have priority over freedom of contract. Once you accept that, this is not even an issue. But go to Pakistan, go to Ecuador, there will be a lot of capitalists who scream against the regulation of child labor, exactly on the same ground as the ones used by the capitalists in England in the 19th century. So that shows that even the definition of a market is a political exercise. So how can you say that economics should not have any politics? Because the very boundary of economics is defined by politics. Okay, to conclude, the book is not just an explanation of economic theories and facts, it's also about the role of economics in public life. And in this regard, I have 3 observations to make. First of all, never trust an economist, and that includes me, I'm not excluding me. Professional economists do not have a monopoly over the truth, even when it comes to economic matters, not to speak of everything. I already told you that there are literally kind of a dozen economic schools, all with different views. They can agree between themselves. And it is entirely possible for people who are not professional economists to have sound judgments on economic issues. And sometimes their judgments may be even better than those of professional economists, because they may be more grounded in reality and less narrowly focused. I would go one step further and argue that the willingness on the part of ordinary citizens to challenge professional economists and other experts is a foundation of democracy. If everything we have to do is just to listen to the experts, why do you need democracy? You don't. So if you want to make democracy meaningful, you should be willing to challenge these experts, challenge professional economists especially. The second point, well, I'm not even pretending to read Latin because I don't know Latin, but these are words that are written apparently on these walls of City Hall of Gouda. I don't know how they managed to come up with something that clever while they were making all those cheese. Listen even to the other side. This is the attitude you should have. Yeah? I'm not saying that you should not have your own opinion. You should. Yeah? But recognizing the complexity of the world, recognizing the necessarily partial nature of all economic theories, you should be humble about the validity of your favorite theory and should keep an open mind about it. And finally, throughout the book, even while I constantly make reform proposals, I emphasize how difficult it is to change the economic reality. Sometimes this is because those who benefit from the status quo want to defend it. Yeah? Through lobbying, bribing, media propaganda, even violence. But capitalist society, the status quo often gets defended even without some people actively being evil. Yeah? Because the market is based on the $1, one vote rule, which means that the ability of those with less money to refuse undesirable options given to them is highly constrained. Yes, so those poor workers in Bangladesh ideally want to have a better job, but that alternative is not offered. Huh? Moreover, people can be susceptible to beliefs that go against their own interests. Many of you might have seen those American pensioners demonstrating against what they call the Obamacare with placards like "Government hands off the my Medicare program." Hang on, I thought that Medicare was a government program. Yeah, so when people believe in that kind of thing, it's very easy for American medical insurance companies to defend their interests, yeah? Because they think actually government program is a private program. Yeah? Well, the Marxists used to call this false consciousness. Yeah? In modern times, we call it the matrix. Yeah? Now, acknowledging the difficulties involved in changing the economic status quo should not make us give up the fight to create a better economy. Yes, changes are difficult, but in the long run, when enough people fight for them, many impossible things happen. 200 years ago, if you advocated abolishing slavery in the United States, people would have called you at best unrealistic. 100 years ago, they put women in prison in this country for asking for vote. Yeah, actually, a lot of women argue that, why do we need vote? We have our husbands and brothers to represent our views. Only 50 years ago, all the founding fathers of today's developing nations were hunted down as terrorists by the British and the French. But these things have all happened because people fought for them. So this is why I quote in the book Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, who once said that we need to have pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. But I can do a lot worse than finishing with this quote from Nelson Mandela, who used to say, "It always seems impossible until it is done." Thank you.
Okay, in the best LSE tradition, we're going to have some time for question and answers, and then after we wrap up the Q&A session, there are copies of Economics, the User's Guide on sale in front, and Ha-Joon is going to stay here and sign your copies. A limited number, because we also have to get him off on a train back to Cambridge, and we want to feed him something before we send him away. So I thought what we'd do is take 2 or 3 questions at a time, And please be brief with your...
Put up the table
Yeah.
of contents. That
Sure.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
So, let me begin.
Hi, I'm Ramin, a member of Public. Don't you find it surprising that Thomas Piketty's book is causing a lot of debate in the economics profession, given that book is mainly a work of economic history and does not follow, the mainstream methodology? Isn't it surprising?
Good question.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. Just for the microphone, just say who you are.
Alpa Shah from Anthropology. I just wanted to ask you a question about where you left off with both Gramsci and Mandela, and what's your position on armed struggle for change? On armed struggle.
Armed struggle, yeah.
For change. You write books like that, you're going to get wide-ranging questions.
Hi, I'm Alexander Zuev. I'm a student here at Development Studies. Dr. Ha-Joon Chang, I would like to thank you for your interesting lecture. I wanted to ask a quick question. Do you think that the rise of new emerging economies would add to the struggle to change economic theory, or would the newly developing countries support the status quo? Maybe you can comment on the economics theory in South Korea. Thank you.
Yeah. Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah. On Piketty, I haven't read the book myself. I mean, it's a daunting prospect, got 850 pages. No, I mean, the very scholarly book, but, it's not something that you can read for bedtime.
Unlike this one.
Yes. No, this you can read for bedtime. Yeah? No, seriously, which economics book has Mary Poppins? Yeah, yeah, there's Mary Poppins in there. Yeah? A full page of it. Yeah, yeah, but the interest surrounding the book is really the reflection of the spirit of the time, or what the Germans call the Zeitgeist. Yeah, I mean, it's less about the book itself, but the issues that it's raising. And there's a huge concern about increasing inequality, and even the Hollywood movies reflect these kind of things. I mean, the movie with the Matt Damon, Elysium. Yeah, I mean, that's what we are going to get if the trends that Piketty is worried about continues. Yeah. Some people live in outer space, living forever with the super advanced medical technology. Everyone else is rotting on Earth. Yeah? So yes, I mean, it's the extreme important. Armed struggle. Well, I think sometimes the regime is so unjust that kind of measures can be justified. I mean, I don't see how you could have brought about changes in South Africa without some kind of armed struggle. But I mean, it's a difficult judgment, because rarely regimes are as straightforwardly evil as the apartheid regime in South Africa. So it's a difficult issue. Yes, I mean, the countries that develop later, are they going to be nicer? Unfortunately, the evidence so far is very limited. Because, Japan had one of the most restrictive regimes when it comes to foreign direct investment. Yeah? But after having developed that in the WTO, they routinely make this submission saying regulating foreign direct investment is bad for economic development. Yeah? Hello, I mean, how did you develop? Yeah? South Koreans complain that, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, they pirate copy out that CDs and DVDs, and come on, I mean, I grew up watching pirate copied Hollywood videos, listening to pirate copied rock and roll LPs, and probably some of those people making that complaint in Korea learned their copyright law with a pirate copy textbook.
Okay,
So ideally there's some evidence that more recently developed countries are slightly more understanding about what developing countries have to do. So we have some hope, but you would have expected them to be a lot more open about this because at least in America and Britain, people can claim that those are things that our great grandfathers did. We don't remember, but in Korea, in Japan, there are millions of people alive who are doing those things, who remember those things, and they still wouldn't do it. Yeah?
Thank you. I can take another round of questions. Yes, the gentleman here.
Hi, I'm a member of public also. I'm not an economist, but I have a kind of a intelligent man's interest in economics. I thought you described economics as a kind of a set of skills and kind of a, approach in which choices and political positions are paramount. Mm-hmm. But you did not touch at all in what way economics is a science. And, so I think that's where, therefore, we can't trust you as to whether you could predict what's coming, mm-hmm. Derived from that scientific approach, if there is one within economics. I'm not sure. So do you want to expand on that? Mm-hmm, is there anything like science within economics, and would that help us predict things?
Thank you. Yes.
If economics does its analysis by measurement, is there a way to measure those things which are currently not measured, like the environment, mothers looking after children? Yeah. How do we ascribe value to that which is not currently measured?
Yeah.
This here in the center. It's harder to pass the microphone. Yes. Yeah. Pass. Sorry. Down here.
Me?
No. Oh. I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Professor Chan. I'm also a development studies student here at LSE. And I'm curious to know your view about the informal economy and how it links to the formal economy, and how globalization, since globalization, the informal economy has been increasing, especially due to outsourcing and global value chains. Sure. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Right, is economic science. Now, there's this widespread view that science should be able to predict. I don't necessarily agree with it, but accepting that view, I actually, in the book, have this quote from John Kenneth Galbraith, who probably was the wittiest the economist ever lived, who said that economic prediction exists to make the astrology respectable. So, record of economic predictions are pretty bad. Yes, you can predict certain things, but these requires quite restrictive assumptions and the very fixed situations. So it's very bad about predicting things that are inherently unpredictable, like a financial bubble or technological progress. If it's about consumer behavior, it's probably reasonably competent and so on. So it depends on which areas you talk about. But my view, as I explained in the book, is that economics can never be a science. Because all of these categories have political and ethical assumptions behind them, and secondly, unlike the objects studied by natural sciences, human beings have free wills. Almost by definition, the economy develops only because some people behave in an irrational way. The entrepreneurs by definition behave in an irrational way. If they were rational, they wouldn't have done those things, because if it was going to succeed and everyone knew it, everyone would have done it and they wouldn't have succeeded. No, this is a serious point. This is what people like Schumpeter and Hayek make to criticize neoclassical economics. So, exactly because of these kind of things, you cannot predict economic behavior in the way you can predict the movement of particles and chemical molecules and so on. Now, can we measure these different things? Yes, I mean, we can. I mean, some people have tried to reconstruct national accounts taking into account environmental damage. Other people have tried to estimate the value of household work, including childcare, care for the elderly, cooking, cleaning, which are mostly done by women. And many estimates agree that this, I mean, if you monetize them, they'll add 30% to national output. But we refuse to count them. Why? I mean, it's a political decision, but, so yes, I mean, in theory, some of these things can be measured, but then, the very reason why they are included or not included is partly political, so that politics has to change. As for the informal economy, yes, I mean, it's a euphemism for survival activities for desperately poor people in most cases. So, this has spread, especially in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, where the economic growth and development have been disrupted, partly because of all these neoliberal policies involving privatization, trade liberalization, opening of capital market, and so on. And yes, I mean, these are sectors where, people work, ostensibly, but they add very little to productivity. I mean, you go to, I don't know, Mexico, you stop at a junction, there'll be these little children rushing to your car, offering unsolicited window cleaning service. Some of them might juggle balls in front of you. Some of them might try to sell chewing gums. In theory, they are working, but what do they add to national product? So yes, I mean, these are huge problems in developing countries, and we need to find ways to basically get people out of those. I mean, unfortunately, thanks to the Peruvian neoliberal lawyer, Hernando de Soto, the informal sector has been glorified into something that is going to be the future of the poor economies. But believe me, there is no country that has built a prosperous economy on the basis of informal sector activities, period.
Yes, gentleman here. Who I preempted.
I call myself, my name is Nicholas Falk, and I call myself an urban economist. And I looked briefly into your book to find something about land or property, which many think is the cause of many of our current problems as a result of the collapse of the banks starting in the States. Well, why is it that economists have stopped thinking about land as a factor of production? And is it just it requires another book, or is it not a legitimate thing to study?
Do we have someone down here? Okay, I've got lots of hands up here. Just get the microphone, sorry.
Hi. Hi. Oh, okay. Yeah. My name is Sue Kim. This is a random question. You said economics explains everything. What do you think about the South Korean economy at the moment? Do you think there should be war with North Korea?
Should be, you mean?
Should there be war? Okay. And just right here. We'll take one more.
Roy Head, I'm an outsider. How can economics help us distinguish between what's useful and what's not? I mean, a lot of economic activity is really, it's fun. I had a builder came to my house, built me a bathroom, I paid him money, he did a great job, we were both happy. And yet so much of the modern world, and I'm thinking particularly the banking sector, involves the creation of something which generates a lot of money, but we don't see it as adding value to our world. Mm-hmm. And yet still it gets calculated in all the economic calculations. So how can economics help distinguish between those two things?
Okay. Yeah. Actually, both the first and the third questions could benefit from people studying classical economics more deeply. I mean, I'm not really a scholar of classical economics, but you know, I mean, the economic theories of Smith and especially Ricardo, I mean, land was crucial because to Ricardo, this rent generated by agriculture, agricultural rent generated by the use of inferior quality land was eating into capitalist profit and holding back capital accumulation and economic development. So for him, this is a major issue. Now that, of course, land has become far less important in economics over time because you know agriculture's importance has declined, and you know increasingly its role as a factor of production declined. Today, land has become important, but not for the same reason. I mean, today is not really factors of production. It's about real estate, people's living space and so on. And in this, I think Fred Hirsch's 1976 book, Social Limits to Growth, and this notion of positional goods is really useful in understanding what's going on, because that positional goods basically means that the value of the good is not really about what it gives you, but the fact that other people do not have it. So basically, even if you become rich and can now afford this nice house in a nice location, someone else has become even more rich, and you still cannot buy it. So I mean, its role has changed, but yes, I mean we could develop some of these classical theories and kind of think about this with this added dimension of positional goods from Fred Hirsch. The third question as well, I mean, the classical economists fought big battles on this notion of productive and unproductive labor. So that they argued, you know, once again, Ricardo was a big advocate of this. He said, you know, all these servants who work for landlords, they add nothing to social productivity. They are unproductive labor. And then later, neoclassical economists said that who are you to judge whether something is productive and unproductive and so on. So, I mean, there's a big debate to be had there. But yes, I mean, you know, basically the way we count the national output is very much kind of non-judgmental, if you like. So, for example, if a country's national income could rise without any rise in the human welfare. For example, there could be a crime wave, and a lot of people might be buying security alarms and hire security guards and so on. So they might be as happy or as secure as they were, but they are spending a lot more money, and therefore national income goes up. So there's a fundamental problem with it. South Korea, well, of course, I don't think they should have a war with North Korea. South Korean economy has been actually has not been doing very well in the last 15 years or so, in my view, because of all these neoliberal reforms that were introduced after the 1997 financial crisis. And we have created a very depressing society. We have the highest suicide rate in the world. Didn't always used to be like that. I mean, until 1995, our suicide rate was below OECD average.
But don't you think, because of North Korea, you know, there's a lot of military problems, money being spent for that, and then don't you think that also creates a lot of suicide rates, a lot of men go to army, the women's rights are very low.
Oh, no. But, you know, those things have been there all the time. And, you know, this increase in suicide rate is very recent. In the last 15 years, it went up from below average to 3 times the OECD average.
Why do you think that's increased so much?
Well, because we have created this society with low job security, virtually no pension for all people, and basically lack of welfare state. Let's leave it at there.
Let me take some other questions. Yes, just in the center.
Hi, I'm one of those irrational people called entrepreneurs, and I think about economics in one way as the allocation of the optimal allocation of resources. That's one definition, right?
Mm-hmm.
So given that it's all about moving pieces on a board, how much of growth is real? The concept of growth assumes, creation of new things. But really, people like me, all we're doing is essentially trying to create new ways of optimizing the allocation of resources. So how much of growth is real? How much of it is really borrowing from future generations? And how much of it is really robbery from those who are usually not, who are not well supported or don't have the means to protect the resources that are then open to the vultures to come and steal in one way or another.
Thank you. And just here.
My name's Jane Wynick. I'm a structural engineer. Do you think economics can help us deal with this terrible problem that we have in London at the moment, that the prices of places for people to live are becoming increasingly out of the reach of ordinary people?
Yeah.
Very good. I can take one more last question here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Suzanne, and I'm also a student in development studies. And I'm also very interested in Thomas Piketty's book, and I'm wondering about your view on inequality, and in your reading of economic history, what has been the role of inequality in economic development, and also what is the role of inequality in development of societies today?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Right. Yes, I mean, the optimal allocation of resources is actually different from economic growth. Yeah, growth means expansion in the resources, and optimal allocation is, given the resources, how do you make use them efficiently. Yeah? Now, of course, the growth doesn't always give you the answer, but up to a point, I mean, for poor countries, growth is usually good. I mean, because for those countries, economic growth means people not dying young. I mean, the people eating another bowl of rice. Yeah, people being able to send their kids to school rather than make them work in dangerous jobs. Yeah, so at the lower level of economic development, growth is very strongly correlated with human welfare. Now, above a certain level, all sorts of complications set in. I mean, the issue of positional goods and what have you. We cannot. We don't have time to discuss that. Once again, please refer to the book. Yeah, house prices. I mean, economists can tell you exactly how to deal with it. Of course, there are many different types of economics, but then yes, I mean that given economic theory, you can have solutions. Yeah. Yeah, so that you could have taxes or restrictions on the I don't know that foreigners like myself buying things. I mean you could have rent control. You could have all sorts of things. Yeah, or you could nationalize all the land like in Singapore. Yeah? Yeah, Singapore didn't start with that. I mean, in the beginning, less than half of land was owned by the government. Yeah? Over time, it has kept buying up. Yeah? Inequality, well, I mean, it's a complicated story. I have a whole chapter, half of a chapter dedicated to it. But my reading of historical evidence is that I mean, if it's too low, it can be bad. If it's too high, it can be bad. Yeah, but then a lot of it is within human control. I mean, that's the important thing. Even today, for example, if you look at the OECD, the statistical base, they give actually two different Gini coefficients, the indicators of income inequality. One is before tax and redistribution, and one is after. Yeah? And if you look at the inequality figures before, Germany is actually more unequal than the United States. Yeah? You know, that they say, the countries have to become unequal because it's all because of technology and international trade and China. But then how do you explain that Switzerland over the last 20 years has become more equal rather than more unequal? Yeah? All countries are subject to same forces of these things. Yeah? Switzerland is even more open than the United States, which is one of the most closed economies in the world. Yeah? So it's all because of different policies about taxation and welfare state and so on that we have different income distribution outcomes. It's not the result of nature, you know. So that never believe anyone if they say, oh, it's technology, it's international forces and things beyond our control. No, they are not. Yeah, we have evidence. Yeah.
Thank you, Ha-Joon. I think we have to wrap up this part now so that you have a chance, if you'd like, to be able to pick up a copy of the book. And if you're kind of crafty and try to get a signature, you might ask another question while he's signing your book. But let us show our appreciation both for the book and the